Well, good morning and welcome to the Adult 3 Bible Study class. If you haven't been with us before, my name is Wofford. I'm one of the team teachers in the class. If you've been watching before, you'll notice that I've lost some weight. I got a haircut. Our lesson today is in the 13th chapter of Romans, beginning with verse 1. You might want to be turning there while I give you a quick update on some things. By the way, I'll be reading from the New International Version of the Bible. Pardon me. Last Sunday, we resumed worship services at church with 2 services. This Sunday, we'll be back to one service at the regular time. Most likely, a number of folks will still be watching at home because we have no nursery or child care this Sunday. And some folks are still not comfortable yet in crowds. And, of course, the normal guidelines about social distancing and building occupancy and the like will still be in place. Just remember that both Bible study and worship services will continue online for several weeks at least. This will allow folks in the high-risk group and those who are not quite ready to go out for whatever reason to attend online. Most likely we'll resume actual Bible study classes in a week or two, and you should watch for announcements from the church office and final details about that. So with that, let's pray and get on with our lesson today. Father, thank you that we can gather together in this way and study your word. Pray that today that you'll open up our spiritual eyes and ears so that we might understand what your word has to say and then understand how to apply it to our everyday lives. And we ask this, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. I've said before that I've lived long enough now that I have a lot of fun with numbers. Some of you, I'm sure, are also in that same boat. For instance, I've been retired for a quarter of a century. Edwina and I have been married for nearly 7 decades. I was 8 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and I remember it well. I remember things like ration stamps for food and for gasoline. I remember having no chocolate and a lot of other things like that. And during the wartime, I remember a very long list of wartime casualties in the newspapers when the whole world was literally at war. I remember VE and VJ Day. I remember a lot of stuff in those days, because in those days the best was called for from all of our citizens, and that included changes in our lifestyle and very often great physical sacrifice, including the ultimate sacrifice for far too many. We're in the throes of a somewhat similar situation with the COVID-19 virus, and all of us have been called to sacrifice. Every one of us has been asked to give up some of our personal freedom, and this has led to a great deal of inconvenience for many, and in too many cases, the sacrifice of both financial security and even perhaps the loss of jobs and businesses. It seems that every aspect of our life has been affected in some way. And most are saying that this same lifestyle that we enjoyed before we had COVID-19 pandemic we'll never enjoy again. So in many ways, our lesson today is very, very timely. Pardon me. Our lesson today is entitled Citizens. Today, Paul continues his practical application of the theology he presented in Romans. Last Sunday, he dealt with the impact of salvation on the life of the believer and relationships within the congregation of believers. Today, in chapter 13, he moves outside the church and begins dealing with Christians and their relationships with government and with our neighbors. Chapter 13 contains some of the Bible's most detailed teachings about the Christian's walk and relationship with all levels of government, some of the most detail that could be found anywhere in the Bible. Now, you need to remember that at this time, Nero was emperor of Rome. There were no Christian governments and very few Christians, if any, in government. The Roman government under Nero was extremely corrupt. Roman citizens had some rights, And you'll recall that at times Paul exercised his Roman citizenship rights for personal protection and to gain some advantages for himself. If you weren't a Roman citizen like Paul, you didn't enjoy a lot of the things that Paul did. In Romans 13, Paul is ever the pragmatist, and he deals with questions that were really running amok among the Christians of his day. Such questions as, how could Christians support such a corrupt government as the Roman government? Such questions as, if Christians are kingdom citizens and we're taught not to conform to this world, why should we be subject to obeying Roman law? Such questions as, is it possible for a Christian to be a good citizen and a good Christian at the same time? You know, the same questions, I guess modernized a bit, are still circulating today. Well, Paul dives right into these issues in the first part of chapter 13. And he has a very lengthy first passage that we're going to deal with. We begin by reading with verse 1. Paul says this. Pardon me again. Everyone must submit himself to the government authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you, for he is God's servant to you for good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of the possibility of punishment, but also because of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give everyone what you owe him. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Now, in this passage, Paul gives three basic reasons that we should be good citizens in whichever society we live. His first reason is a foundational principle. He begins by saying that everyone should submit themselves to governmental authorities. In other words, Christians are to be good citizens in whatever government situation they find themselves. Do we see that today? Well, I've had a lot of experience through the years, and I'd like to chase that rabbit for a long ways right now, but we don't have time. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Paul says that everyone must submit. Who does that include? Well, it includes both Christians and non-Christians alike. Certainly everyone who's reading Paul's letter to the Romans, and certainly every one of us who are reading it today. Now, submit means to obey or to be subject to. It's a very strong word. What government authorities does Paul say we must submit to? All of them. In our country, that would be federal, state, and local. Well, why should Christians submit to those authorities? Paul goes on to give us a theological basis. He says that all authority comes from God. This implies that governments have been set up by God. So submitting to governmental authorities, in effect, if you follow that rationale, is being obedient to God. And to rebel against governmental authorities is, in effect, to rebel against God. Paul says that when we resist authority, we bring judgment on ourselves. From the text now, it's not clear whether Paul's talking about the present judgment under the law or future judgment by the Lord. Probably he's talking about a bit of both. Well, now that begs the question, does Paul mean that even the corrupt Roman government that was in existence at that day was set up by God? Yeah. Would that include the evil German and Russian dictatorships of the 20th century? Yeah. You see, none of those governments would have existed if God, in His permissive will, did not allow them to exist. Now, before you get a bit uptight about that, remember that in the Old Testament, the Lord used pagan kings and heathen nations as tools to bring about His will. In Jesus' day, the Roman government provided worldwide peace. And it also provided a universal language that was spoken by everybody. That set up the conditions perfectly for Jesus to come and to carry out His ministry and mission in the world. Have you ever thought that it might even be possible that the Lord used World War II as a tool to establish the Jewish nation of Israel that exists today? I'm not saying that He did. I'm just saying that, think about it, that might be a possibility. Now, that begs another question. Does Paul mean that we should submit to a government when they direct us to do something that is contrary to Scripture? Well, submit means to recognize authority, but it does not necessarily mean that we must always obey authority. Now, do we have a biblical example to follow in that case? Well, yes. Do you remember when Peter and John had been called before the high priest and the Sanhedrin, the religious authorities of that day that they respected, because they'd been preaching the gospel of Jesus? They were directed by those authorities that they all respected and generally obeyed, to stop preaching in the name of Jesus. Do you remember what they said in reply to that directive? In the 4th chapter of Acts, we read these words: "But Peter and John replied, 'Judge for yourself whether it is right in God's sight to obey you rather than God, for we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard.'" In essence, they said they respected the authority of the religious leaders. However, they said in this particular instance, they were subject to a higher authority, God. Therefore, they were not going to obey, but instead they were going to continue to preach the gospel of Jesus. Now, don't miss the point that they were willing to accept the consequences of their disobedience. They were willing to do this because the authorities had ordered them to do something other than what God had directed them to do. So there may be times when civil disobedience is the right thing for a Christian to do. We need to just make sure that what's done is biblically based. For example, it's not right to bomb an abortion clinic in the name of Jesus. There's a group in this world that claims the right to murder innocent people in the name of God. We call them Islamic fundamentalists, or ISIS. The principle of biblical submission is to obey the greater authority, and if necessary, then disobey the lesser. As long as the lesser authority, in this case government, does not contradict the greater authority, God, then we are to obey the government. When a conflict occurs, we must obey the greater authority, God. When we choose disobedience because of conscience, then we must understand that we have to live with the consequences of that choice. Now, Paul's second reason is based on very practical advice regarding authority. It's quite simple. You want to avoid trouble? Obey the rules. Have you ever been driving down the road faster than the speed limit and see a highway patrol car? What do? Slow down. I remember a number of years ago, I was coming down I-10 east from San Antonio in the left-hand lane, making very, very good time, when I looked up and I saw behind me flashing red and blue lights. And I thought, oh boy, I've had it. I pulled over, and the lights went past me. And I said, thank you, Lord. What was the problem there? I understood the consequences of breaking the speed limit rules. Paul says that those who obey the rules, those who are obedient to the law, have no fear of authority or traffic cops. Paul says that obey the law and you will do good and have nothing to fear. Now, why should we live in fear of the law? Well, we've got to remember that in this context, fear means respect. We should respect the law and be obedient to it. If we break the law, we're likely to face the consequences. Paul says that the government does not carry the sword just to look nice. Carrying the sword here implies the power and authority to punish, even to the punishment of death, which was very, very common, by the way, in Paul's day. Paul says that government has the God-given assignment to punish wrongdoing and to promote good. Government has the responsibility to maintain peace and domestic safety, including attacks from governments and other things, whatever they might be. Paul makes it clear that God instituted governments in general and that he has power over all governments. Does that mean that governments will always do God's will? Do you always do God's will? Governments will not always follow God's will any more than you and I will always follow God's will. Governments are not always right. They don't always make the best laws. Yet a world with governments is much better than a world without governments. For instance, could you imagine what Houston traffic would be like without traffic lights, traffic laws, and some officers to enforce them? In verse 5, Paul puts in one of those therefores. He says that because of what he's just made clear, we must submit to the authority of government. We may submit for fear of punishment. And that is a good reason for submission, by the way. Yet Paul says that there's a third and even better reason that we should submit. He says we should submit because of conscience. Now, what does that imply? That we know the difference between right and wrong from the spiritual considerations as well as from the moral and ethical and legal considerations. Christians should do what's right simply because we're followers of Jesus Christ. Jesus' commands should shape our thinking and direct our actions. If we're obedient to the commands of Jesus, in most every case, that will cause us to be right in the eyes of the law. I remember a co-worker at Monsanto named Martin McLean. Some of you out here may know him. He lived in Santa Fe the latter part of his life. When others were taking stuff home in their lunch boxes, what many called fringe benefits, they were what? In reality, stealing. Martin said that his job wasn't worth what he could carry out in a lunchbox. Now, Martin may have been doing what was right out of fear, but I think he was doing what was right because he knew what was wrong and refused to do it. As Christians, we should strive to do what's right and avoid what is wrong as a matter of conscience. That's what Paul's saying. Well, having established the basis for submission to governmental authority, Paul then goes on to give us some practical advice about dealing with governments. Paul says, pay your taxes. The Greek word translated taxes means tribute tax. It's the same word the religious leaders used when they asked Jesus if it was lawful to pay taxes to Caesar. Did you notice anything about what Paul said? He said that there is a reason for you to pay taxes. And what was that reason? He says because governmental authorities are God's public servants. The word that Paul uses for servants here implies a servant of God, like a priest in a temple. Paul is almost putting our obligation to government alongside with our obligation to God. Paul puts it this way, Jesus puts it this way in the 22nd chapter of Matthew. He says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So Paul's almost teaching that paying taxes is a religious duty as well as a civic duty. just as Jesus pointed out. Now, we have an obligation to support our government financially, even as we have a religious duty to support our church with our tithes and offering. So, bottom line, don't cheat on your income tax. Paul then adds 3 more ways that believers are to show submission to government. The first way is that Christians should pay their obligations to everyone. We're to pay taxes and tolls when we owe them. In Paul's day, the Roman government collected tolls that today we call customs duties. They also collected taxes and fees of many different kinds. Paul said that we should pay all those various taxes and fees that the government imposes upon us, things like sales taxes, auto taxes, property taxes, and the like. In other words, he's saying Christians should not be deadbeats. Paul goes on to say that there's a second way that we show submission, and that's to fear or respect those who we owe fear or respect. Again, fear here means respect. Ever hear police officers referred to as pigs? Does that show respect? Many in public service deserve our respect. Firefighters, police officers, EMTs come immediately to mind. But today there are many others. Today there are people like medical professionals and their staff, truck drivers, post office workers, grocery store staff, maintenance people, and others who took a lot of personal risk to keep life as best we know it going during this pandemic. We should show respect to all of those people. And by the way, that includes having good manners even when we don't feel like it. The third way that Paul says that we should show submission is to honor those to whom we owe honor. Now, that's a bit more of a problem, for at least for me. Nowadays, when there's all this political and other divisiveness, there's public scandals, there's corruption in the government, there's spin doctrine of all sorts. It's kind of hard to honor a public servant that's taking bribes and having an affair with his secretary. I had problems in this area that I got straight a number of years ago when I was dealing with a horses derriere at work. Ron was a senior level manager, and he was one of the most obnoxious men I'd ever had to deal with. I finally realized that even though I did not respect the individual holding this position, I should respect the position itself. So I began to deal with Ron on the basis of the position he held rather than the kind of person that he was. After that, things pretty well sorted themselves out between us. So even though we may not be able to honor some individuals in public life, we can certainly honor the positions they hold. Now there's another interpretation that many hold concerning this statement about honor. Some interpret this passage to say that we owe taxes to the government, but we owe honor and respect only to God. And that's a valid interpretation, and I'll leave that to you to make your decision about which interpretation you choose. As we read on, Paul gives us some advice about relationships with others by telling us to meet our personal obligations. He says this, beginning in verse 8, "Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For he who loves his fellow man has fulfilled the law. The commandments, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, and whatever other commandments there may be are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." Paul begins by telling us to owe no one or let no debt remain outstanding, depending on your translation. Now, does Paul mean that we're to operate on a strictly cash basis and never use credit cards or have loans of any kind? Well, some interpret this passage to forbid the borrowing of money. Now, Paul's not saying that we should not have mortgages on our homes or our automobiles or use credit cards. A lot of us would have a lot of trouble getting by without those. without mortgages, I doubt any of us could buy a home. Rather, Paul's saying that Christians should honor the debts that we make and pay them according to the terms that were agreed when the debts were made. In other words, we should be faithful to make the loan payments on time and of the correct amount. Now, there's a problem here that could creep in if we don't watch out. Did you catch it? What is it? The problem is that we put the emphasis on finances and not on the main focus of the passage, which is love. Now, Paul says that we have an unfilled obligation to our fellow man. What is it? He says to love your neighbor as yourself. Paul says this fulfills the law. Which law? Well, obviously the Mosaic law. Paul goes on to quote let me start again. Paul goes on to quote some of the commandments that specifically deal with the way we treat others. But there are a lot more laws than just those few. If you want a breakdown, I would suggest you read the book of Exodus and Leviticus. You'll find more laws there than you want to deal with. I'm reminded of the old Frank and Ernest cartoon where they're standing in a modern law library with the walls filled from floor to ceiling, from wall to wall with law books of all different kinds and types. And Frank is saying to Ernest, and to think, all this started with just 10 commandments. Now, Paul's saying we don't need a whole library. All we need to do is follow the second great commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. Paul then adds that there's another one of those therefores, I guess I would say. He says that we do this, and when we love our neighbor as ourselves, we fulfill the whole law, because love itself is the fulfillment of the law. As we read on, Paul gives some other admonitions about our personal conduct. Beginning in verse 11, he says this, and do this, understanding the present time. The hour has come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when you first believed. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us behave decently, as in the daytime, not in orgies or drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. Rather, clothe yourself with the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not think about how to glorify the desires of the sinful nature. Paul begins by telling us to do this because of the current conditions. We've been asked to do a lot of difficult and sometimes different things because of the current conditions. He said that we should wake up to things going on around us. Would Paul include the COVID-19 pandemic as one of the things that disrupted our lives and forces so much these days? Perhaps, but as you read on, as you continue to read, you begin to understand that Paul's really not talking about such stuff as that. He's really talking about spiritual matters. And he's talking about the return of Jesus. Now, when will Jesus come again in all his glory and majesty? Well, no one knows, but it's definitely less than 85 years that I've been on this earth. Well, what's the main point that Paul's trying to get across here? That we should put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. That's what he says. Now, in the Bible, light and darkness are often used to represent God's future kingdom and the present evil age, respectively. Paul's making the point that the lives we live should reflect the fact that we're Christians. In today's jargon, he's saying that we should walk the walk and not just talk the talk. He says to conduct yourself like it's day, not night. Ever notice how much bad activity and behavior takes place at night, not during the day? Well, Paul then goes on to list some of the bad behaviors that take place in darkness. He talks about orgies and drunkenness and sexual immorality and all kinds of stuff like that. Now, when he went through this list, was there anything special that caught your attention when you read through it? The list includes quarreling or dissensions, and it includes jealousy. And it's in the same list that includes sexual orgies. Ever thought about things in that light? Paul says that creating disagreement or disunity in the body of believers, the church, is as bad as engaging in sexual orgies. Something to think about when we consider how we parse sins today in the areas of abortion, sleeping around, homosexuality, and a lot of other areas. Instead, Paul tells us to put on Jesus like a cloak or a mantle. And what does he mean by that? That we should live our lives in such a way that we exhibit the transforming power of Jesus in our lives. We should have the mind of Christ, and we should live with a biblical worldview, not a secular worldview. Our character should reflect that we're disciples of Jesus. In other words, Paul says be serious about your Christian walk and not just superficial in your faith. Paul closes by telling us not to make any plans to satisfy our fleshly desires. Now, does Paul mean that I shouldn't plan to have a bowl of Bluebell when I watch TV? I think not. He's not talking about things like that there. He's talking about Christian living. This whole passage has been about Christian living. Paul is saying that we have choices to make and that we should choose to live and to behave like Christians. We can choose to live as good citizens and godly neighbors, good neighbors, or we can choose to act in other ways. Paul says the best choice is for us to show love and respect for others. So, after that fast discussion of this first half of the chapter 13, what does all that boil down to? Well, let me suggest three things. First, that we should be good citizens by obeying the law, paying our taxes, and showing respect to those in authority, as long as that does not compromise our basic Christian beliefs and principles. Second, we should love our neighbors as ourselves and demonstrate that love by the way that we treat others. As far as possible, we should strive to be at peace and harmony with everybody around us. Finally, we have choices to make in our everyday life. Our best choice is to live by Christian standards and to live a high moral and ethical lifestyle that reflects the transformation that Jesus Christ has made in our lives. So, that quickly gets us through our lesson today. Next week we'll continue our study in Romans and look at what's required for unity in the body of believers. Take care and God bless.